So last time we talked about Edgar Allan Poe's American adaptation of European Gothic tropes. Today we're going to be talking about another writer who takes material frequently from European sources and transforms them into something a little that expresses particularly American anxieties about the frontier, about expansionism, about even about their very neighbors, right, in other states and other colonies. So the story that we're going to be looking at is probably mostly familiar to you from cartoons, Halloween specials, maybe even that Tim Burton movie with Christopher Walken and Johnny Depp, right? The source material for all of those things looks very, very different from all of those sort of pop culture products of it, right? You will still, by the way, see in Tarrytown and Sleepy Hollow, the towns mentioned in the tale, there's all kinds of Ichabod Crane crap all over the place, right? So they have adopted this identity to something they can sell to tourists, kind of like the same way Salem, Massachusetts markets itself as the witch city, right? And there are all these sort of witch museums, and you can go into various restaurants and buy witch burgers and things like that. That's a disturbing thought. Anyhow, so one thing to remember is that Irving is primarily a comic writer. He's primarily a satirist. So what he is not necessarily interested in is actually horrifying you or shocking you the way Poe is. But the way he frames Ichabod Crane's story and the way he sort of provides multiple possible endings to the story, those are the undecidability of Ichabod Crane's fate, right, is ultimately what makes this particular story an ancestor of the weird. All right, so let's look first at the larger work of which these two short texts are a part. That is Washington Irving as a young man. And the book on which his reputation largely rests today is called The Sketchbook. The Sketchbook was published more or less simultaneously in the US and in Britain. It's published in short installments in the US between June 1819 and September 1820, and then in 2 volumes in England in February and then in July 1820. This was actually sort of the normal way 19th century books were published, right? If you were publishing a novel, for example, you wouldn't bring the whole thing out at once. You would bring it out in maybe, say, 2 to 5 volumes. And when the first volume came out, you would probably still be writing volume 2. Right? It was not normal for a book to come out, at least in its initial appearance, as a single 1-volume manuscript. Now, the Sketchbook becomes enormously successful in Europe. And so Washington Irving, even though he is not really part of the great pantheon of American authors today, he is the first American writer to achieve an international reputation. He's the first American writer to be widely known outside of the United States. So a couple of details about the Sketchbook, right? First, it's constructed with a kind of frame narrative. There's a sort of distancing device here. Irving adopts the identity of Geoffrey Crayon, gentleman, which you can sort of get a sense of the character he's setting up in Crayon if you read the author's account of himself at the very beginning of our text. But this kind of distancing device, right, of the author from the narrator becomes very, very common in the 19th century Gothic and in the weird as well. Right, so Geoffrey Crayon is not Washington Irving. He's an invented character who was in many ways quite different from Irving himself. And to further complicate matters, not all of the material in the sketchbook is supposed to have been written by Crayon. Some of it is merely collected by him. Much of the work that is attributed to Crayon in the book is these little kind of local color sketches of life in rural England, habits in rural New York, things of that nature. Whereas many of the short stories, which often feature old Dutch settlers in the colony and in the state of New York, are attributed to a fictional Dutch historian by the name of Diedrich Knickerbocker. So there's a narrative nested within this narrative. And we also see, if we look at the various Knickerbocker stories, like Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, there's a narrative there about Knickerbocker as well. That these are found among his papers after he mysteriously disappears. So there's a story hinted at within the wider context of the sketchbook. In fact, probably a horrifying story. Now, Irving is heavily influenced by an 18th century trend known as the literature of sensibility. It's a kind of forerunner of Romanticism. And Chris Baldick of the in the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms writes that the literature of sensibility is an important 18th century term designating a kind of sensitivity or responsiveness that is both aesthetic and moral, showing a capacity to feel both for others' sorrows and for beauty. And it's largely a reaction against the belief that human behavior is essentially selfish. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes, for example, wrote in his work Leviathan, right, that essentially we give up some of our essential rights and obligations to the government in order to have our private property protected from those who would take it from us. Right? So to preserve our self-interest, we join communities. What writers in the literature of sensibility were doing was sort of contesting that particular notion, right? That we are merely selfish, self-interested creatures, that in fact we are affected by our environments, by our surroundings, and by the communities in which we live, that we're responsive to both aesthetic and moral stimuli. And I think that in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Ichabod Crane represents a kind of moral threat to the social order in Sleepy Hollow that the people then kind of band together and push out. So let's talk first about the mutability of literature, which is the shorter and much less important piece. But there are specific reasons why I wanted you to read it. Right? First, its location is particularly Gothic. Right? Westminster Abbey, the great British church, where all of the important figures in British history are buried. Right? There's the Poets' Corner, where they have monuments to great British writers of the past. Most British monarchs are buried there. Kings and queens have their coronation at Westminster Abbey. So it's this location that is invested with a sense of deep historical importance. Now, the epigraph to the mutability of literature, just to identify that for it, it's Sonnet 2 by William Drummond. So if you want to go and look that up. And we see from the first page of the story the reversal of that Gothic trope of the past intruding upon the present. Right? We saw that, for example, in The Fall of the House of Usher. The family curse, the family history, the family house constrains the present expectations of the Usher twins. Here in the mutability of literature, we have this place that's devoted to the past and the preservation of the past, and yet it's attached to a school, And so the present and future are intruding upon this great monument to the glorious past. Right? I was loitering about the old gray cloisters of Westminster Abbey, enjoying that luxury of wandering thought which one is apt to dignify with the name of reflection, when suddenly an interruption of madcap boys from Westminster School, playing at football, broke in upon the monastic stillness of the place, making the vaulted passages and moldering tombs echo with their merriment. This is not the first place we'll see Westminster Abbey described as a kind of tomb in this particular text. But the impulse here for the narrator is to retreat further into the tomb, to move from these outer reaches where the present can still come in and intrude. In fact, the future, because it's boys, potential men coming in and making noise. And the whole thing kind of sets up this juxtaposition between stillness, stasis, and transience. Right? So we're going to look at the relationship between these two concepts in the text as we have it. So he goes deeper into the Abbey, into its library, and he writes, "I found myself in a lofty antique hall, the roof supported by massive joints of old English oak. It was soberly lighted by a row of Gothic windows at a considerable height from the floor, and which apparently opened upon the roofs of the cloisters. In the center of the library was a solitary table with 2 or 3 books on it, an inkstand without ink, and a few pens parched by long disuse. The place seemed fitted for quiet study and profound meditation. It was buried deep among the massive walls of the Abbey and shut up from the tumult of the world." So he finds this peace in a kind of secret inner sanctum of the Abbey, right, which has been, and the phrase he uses here to describe is long disuse. This is not a place people typically go. It's secret, it's quiet, it's claustrophobic, it's closed in, right? This is a Gothic space. "I could not but consider the library a kind of literary catacomb, where authors, like mummies, are piously entombed and left to blacken and molder in dusty oblivion." This is not a place to go to find copies of those works that have defined the history of English literature. This is a place to go and lose yourself among forgotten books that have been put away, that have been buried. And indeed, he unearths just one such book and has a conversation with it. Right? This is, by the way, one of the tombs in Westminster Abbey. I believe it's the tomb of Edward III. So this leads him to reflect on how ephemeral literary reputation is, and how even the lifespan of a book can be as short as that of a human being. How much, thought I, has each of these volumes, now thrust aside with such indifference, cost some aching head? How many weary days? How many sleepless nights? How have their authors buried themselves in the solitude of cells and cloisters, shut themselves up from the face of man and the still more blessed face of nature, and devoted themselves to painful research and intense reflection? And all for what? To occupy an inch of dusty shelf, to have the title of their works read now and then in a future age by some drowsy churchman or casual straggler like myself, and in another age to be lost, even to remembrance. So, the books that are buried here are buried to be lost. They're buried to be forgotten. The pains that human beings expend on their life's work amount to nothing. and we all end up in the tomb. Right? He's playing here on a theme called memento mori, right? Remembrance of death. The idea that we are all marked for the grave. Language gradually varies, and with it fade away the writings of authors who have flourished in their allotted time. Otherwise, the creative powers of genius would overstock the world, and the mind would be completely bewildered in the endless mazes of literature. So this is actually rather a ridiculous argument to make for why it's a good thing that so many works are lost or forgotten. But here's sort of where it's coming from. In the late 18th century, there was an economist by the name of Thomas Malthus who argued that unless some check was placed on population growth, eventually there would be more people on the earth than the planet's resources could support. And what Irving is doing here through the character of Geoffrey Crayon is making the argument that literature follows Malthusian principles as well, right? If some works don't die, right, if they're not entombed and forgotten, then there will be so much great stuff out there, there will be so much great art, that there's no possible way that new creative minds could flourish. It would simply bury the creativity of younger generations. What a crock of horse shit. Now, let's move on to talk about The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which shares some themes in common with the mutability of literature. Now, much of the argument between Irving and the book, or between Geoffrey Crayon and the book, is framed as a kind of rational gentleman making logical arguments against a snobbish book that has spent the last century or so of its existence walled up in a tomb. Now, there is a dichotomy in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow as well that's set up between rationality and superstition. And we can see this most clearly, I think, in the separate accounts that are given of Ichabod Crane's ultimate fate. First, let's start with the rational account. There we have Sir Isaac Newton experimenting with lenses, right? So the crown prince of the rational. An old farmer who had been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood, partly through fear of the goblin and Hans van Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress, that he had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time, had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for the newspapers, and finally had been made a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was related. So what we have here is a completely reasonable and logical explanation for Ichabod Crane's disappearance and subsequent fate that has nothing whatsoever to do with the supernatural, right? Except, of course, Crane's own rather credulous belief in ghosts, goblins, and witches, right? He's afraid to confront the farmer he borrowed the horse from, given that he lost the guy's good saddle. He is afraid of the ghost that haunts the churchyard, and he's upset at having been rejected by Katrina, right? So, in dejection and terror, he flees the neighborhood and sets himself up somewhere else. Right, clearly, Brom Bones, who makes out quite well from all of this, was behind the mysterious apparition. All of this makes perfect sense, right? All of this is perfectly logical. But it's not the final word on Crane and what happened to him. We have a second explanation, which involves spooks and demons. The old country wives, however, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means, and it is a favorite story often told about the neighborhood around the winter evening fire. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late years, so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond. So, the old farmer story seems to be largely rejected by the locals in favor of the account of the old country wives. The bridge is creepy. There's something weird about it. That's where ghosts hang out. Okay, so we'll reroute the road to avoid it. Clearly, Ichabod was kidnapped by ghouls. That's why no one's seen him. That's what's happened to him. Now, the story kind of sets these two explanations up as kind of almost as kind of equivalent, right? You can believe in the rational explanation if you want, but this is what all the locals think happened. This is what all the locals believed. And this has to do with the fact that Sleepy Hollow and its environs are set up really kind of as feminine space. And here's what I mean by this. Let's look at a couple of other quotes that really kind of define this for us. First, at the very beginning of the tale, in the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, there lies a small market town or rural port, which is called by some Greensboro, but which is more generally known and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given, we are told, in former days, by the good housewives of the adjacent country, from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. So the local market town is given its name by women describing their husbands' lazy proclivities. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, yet I question whether I should not still find the same trees vegetating in its sheltered bosom. Right? The terms in which Sleepy Hollow is described are feminine, almost maternal. And finally, we look at where Ichabod Crane spends most of his time and where he picks up much of his lore. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by the fire, with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and listen to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins, and haunted fields, and haunted brooks, and haunted houses, and particularly of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes called him. So the hearth is where these superstitious traditions are passed on. And it's here that Ichabod gobbles up all of these tales of ghosts and goblins. The old wives are the authorities in folklore. And I think there's another reason why Ichabod likes hanging out around hearths as well. There is a discourse of consumption centered on this particular character. Right, and here we have an image of him from the Disney cartoon wearing a turkey on his head and eating his own hat. First, when he is described to us physically, to see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. Right? So his very appearance suggests a kind of insatiable hunger. He was a huge feeder, and though lank, had the dilating powers of an anaconda. Right? He can swallow prodigious amounts of anything, including information. He was, in fact, an odd mixture of small shrewdness and simple credulity. His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in the spellbound region. No tale was too gross or monstrous for his capacious swallow. So even the folk tales that he learns from the old wives, he's not depicted as simply listening to them or learning them by heart, right? He devours them, right? He eats them. Everything he sees, he thinks of in terms of sort of something to consume and digest, right? To take this a little bit further, when he is preparing to court Katrina Van Tassel, right? He looks upon the goods of the farm that she stands to inherit. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put together in a bed in a comfortable pie with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce. In the porkers he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy relishing ham. Not a turkey, but he beheld daintily trussed up, with its gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages. And even bright Chanticleer himself, the rooster, lay sprawling on his back in a side dish with uplifted claws, as if craving that quarter which his chivalrous spirit disdained to ask while living. Every animal on the farm Ichabod imagines as something for himself to eat. These are all to provide a meal for our pedagogue, for our starving schoolmaster. Right, so he would not be a good steward of the farm. Right? His goal is simply to eat it, to devour it. We see this as well as his musings continue. As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this, and as he rolled his great green eyes over the fat meadowlands, the rich fields of wheat, of rye, of buckwheat and Indian corn, and the orchards burdened with a ruddy fruit which surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel, his heart yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains, and his imagination expanded with the idea how they might be readily turned into cash, and the money invested in immense tracts of wild land, and shingle palaces in the wilderness. Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes, and presented to him a blooming Katrina with a whole family of children mounted on the top of a wagon loaded with household trumpery, with pots and kettles dangling beneath, and he beheld, with himself bestriding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky, Tennessee, or the Lord knows where. So what is it he wants to do to Katrina's farm? He wants to sell the whole lot and invest the money in developing land on the frontier. Right? We'll get rid of this stupid farm. We'll eat everything on it. We'll transfer everything else to cash. And then we'll spend that money building little cabins out in Kentucky or Tennessee. So all of this capital leaves the community, leaves this sheltered feminine location, and is turned into a masculine dream of deforestation and development. This is why Ichabod represents a threat, right? This is why he's problematic for local values. Whereas Brom Bones, the local troublemaker, right? All of his antics are basically harmless, right? He is to transition over the course of the tale from boisterous bachelorhood into settled married life in the community that he's always lived in. Ichabod, on the other hand, as the invader, as the destroyer, who simply wants to take from Sleepy Hollow, has to be eliminated, has to be run out of town. And so he has his own encounter with the uncanny in the form of the Headless Horseman. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless. But his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. So the human form thus altered, right? Without the usual marker of identity, prompts Ichabod to break into a panic and to flee. Right? The Headless Horseman is an uncanny occurrence. Looks like a normal person, looks like a human being riding a horse, until you note, oh hey, his head is slung across the saddle. It's not on his shoulders where it's supposed to be. And it's this encounter with the uncanny that leads to that kind of undecidable ending, right? What happened to Ichabod? And one thing I want you guys to think about as you consider the story is the extent to which either explanation for Ichabod's disappearance is endorsed. And I think you can probably find some clue if you read the little postscript to the story, like sort of as to which ending we're supposed to settle on. All right, so that's it for Washington Irving. For next time, you're going to be reading one of the earliest vampire stories in English, Carmilla by Sharon Le Fanu. And I want you to think about how closely Carmilla seems to resemble other vampire characters with which you're already familiar. Right? To what extent is she a typical vampire? To what extent is this a typical vampire story? I also want you to think about the nature of Carmilla's advances upon Laura. To what extent do her attentions seem to be at least partly sexual in nature? And so what? And I think we can make some connections here as well between Carmilla and the Mask of the Red Death. If we think about the fact that Carmilla's attacks on the community are mistaken for a disease. So try to think about what particular 19th century anxieties this story seems to be playing on. And finally, what do you make of the resolution of the story? How is the vampire finally detected, and now how are her depredations stopped? Right? To what extent is this a gendered conflict as well? All right, that's all I have for you. We'll pick this up next time with Carmilla.